The Cherokee removal in the U.S. started at the very beginning of colonization, with treaties being needed just to get along. Soon after, greed for land and money escalating hatred and leading to further feelings of wanting the Cherokees gone. The idea that capitalism fuels colonization is something we learned previously from Fanon, and it applies to this situation on the emphasis on colonization for the whites. The violence stems from the greediness created by capitalism and colonization. Although the actual removal process didn't take place until 1838, the situations and circumstances leading up to the crisis shaped the society then and the U.S. now. The beginning of this nation brought upon many feelings for the colonizers, but one specific feeling being the Indian problem. Like many times in the past and current days, American people, the white majority, ache for America to be as white as it can be. It was mentioned in this article from the history page that the point of the journey of civilizing the Native Americans was primarily to make them as white as they could make them. The history behind the crisis of the Cherokee removal begins with the Treaty of Holston, which is an agreement of peace between the two nations, the U.S. government and the Cherokee nations. Then, the issue became involved with the colonizers wanting for further expansion of land, with emphasis on profit. Although capitalism played a large role in this country, as it continues to do, the lack of land would detriment the Cherokee nation. The Cherokee life required lots of land for trapping, fishing, hunting, and farming, as well as for ceremonies that used wild plants and streams of clear running water. So the importance of this land was major because it was their way of survival. The whites were wanting land to prosper on and expand settlement, as well as profit from growing cotton. In 1828, prospectors began finding gold in Georgia. The Georgians then began confiscating land from the Cherokees for profit, only increasing the reasoning for taking the land. They had decided that, quote, all means necessary was the method to use to get the land they wanted. Methods such as stealing animals, burning and looting houses, and committing mass murders were used to try and get the native Indians to leave their land and move on, all before the forceful removal was even brought about. This brought about the Treaty of the Cherokee Agency, which dealt with the Cherokee Nation agreeing to decrease its territory to a small patch of land bordering Georgia, which can be seen in the image, but also promising land west of the Mississippi for the land given up. The treaty was signed by 31 Cherokee leaders, yet a majority of the Cherokee Nation fought heavily against this treaty. They began the process with trying to make the Indians as similar to them as they could, aka assimilation. They called it civilization. A congressman at the time explained that the civilization plan was proof that the Cherokees were subhuman because its whole objective was to, quote, reform their barbarous laws and customs and miserable superstitions. This going on to prove and broaden the point that the main issue at hand was race and racism. This then could be established as racism justified removal. The whites thought of the Indians in very negative ways. The views can be seen in a quote from an article from Duke Law that states, "You can't tame a savage," which is the whites speaking of the Native Americans at the time. Jackson, the president at the time, argued that the Cherokees were aliens who had no rights and could be governed by the states. Although he thought of them as nothing, deserving nothing, he wanted the right to govern them and control them at all costs. The state decided confiscation of the land was not good enough, instead continued to enforce hatred towards the Cherokees. They put a law into place that, quote, no Indian or descendant of any Indian shall be deemed a competent witness in any court of this state to which a white person may be party. In other words, finding societal ways to push them out was their goal. The people of the tribe were labeled as people of color by the people and law of Georgia. This means another societal pull on them by not being allowed to vote or serve in the militia. Lastly, Georgia persecuted anyone that helped them or tried to stray them away from negotiating agreements. These people would either serve lengthy prison time or receive the death penalty. One example of automatically receiving the death penalty was if you were to kill someone that was looking to immigrate. Georgia also wanted to push out any whites that were sympathetic to the Cherokees. They created a new law that made all whites wanting to live in the tribal area swear an oath recognizing Georgia's sovereignty, and they also would have to obtain a license from the government. The Georgia government and people searched for any way possible to outlaw Cherokees, or sympathy for these people. This is another example of nonviolent tactics of achieving their goal, stripping their human rights away as if they were nothing. Jeremiah Evarts, the American Board's secretary, was largely responsible for the anti-removal protest that led to the first national petition drive against legislation. This led to college campuses, women's groups, and town meetings to flood Congress with petitions and pamphlets about the Indian removal. Since the American Board and religious groups were fighting against the removal and signing petitions and using other nonviolent tactics, the president ordered that they impound all funds to them, this being pure retaliation. It was said, quote, "The government by its funds should not extend encouragement and assistance to those who employ their efforts to prevent removals," end quote. This basically meaning that, again, any nonviolent effort that they could put forth that would put strain on the Cherokee Nation was going to be put forth. Jackson moving into presidency only allowed for further issues to come about with the Indians. Jackson received very little political issues because his main support came from southern and western states. Jackson was an advocate for Indian removal before his presidency, but once he became president, he enforced this idea further by signing the Removal Act in 1830, allowing the U.S. government to remove the Indian nations west of the Mississippi River. Throughout his presidency and his campaign for presidency, he gave speeches about the removal of the Indians that made them out to be a positive thing, when in fact these removals were brutal. Although Jackson was an advocate for the removal, it wasn't just some straightforward path to automatically removing them. People did fight against them. There was one group, the Cherokees of Georgia, that used legal action. They formed their own community by developing their own language, newspapers, and elected leaders. When the government of Georgia wouldn't recognize them and threatened their land, the Cherokees went to the Supreme Court, aka the birth of Worcester versus Georgia. It was ruled in their favor, but the Georgia government and the president refused to listen to the ruling. George Washington made the earliest attempts to move the natives to the west, and continued attempts were made by many presidents after him. The rough facts of the removal is the numerous amount of Cherokees that had left their homes from Georgia Territory, but when we say left, we mean forced out. It even went as extreme as sending generals to the states to expedite the removal process. Many natives were reaching a point of two paths in the road. Some wanting to just go ahead and take the money and move out west to get their land there, others refusing to leave. The treaty party, made up of 20 Cherokees, signed the Treaty of New Echota, illegally stating that they were the ones that represented the Cherokees. The basis of the fight against removal was sparked by the fact that the Cherokees were mad that they were falsely represented during the signing. This treaty was for negotiation of land, not the forceful removal of the Cherokees. The Choctaw was the first nation to be torn for their land during this removal period. In 1836, Chief John Ross addresses Jackson in a letter regarding the treaty and removal of the natives. He protested the treaty, saying that they were falsely represented by the people that signed it, the ones saying that they would gladly relocate to the west of the Mississippi, when in fact 15,000 Cherokees opposed moving. Later in the years of the removal journey, the process turned from a pushing nonviolent action to violent tactics. The beginning of this started with the president's bill that would authorize federal government to assist the tribes move from Georgia if it refused to submit to the state law. Whites that helped and supported the Cherokees were scrutinized, but furthermore mistreated. They were given 10 days to take the oath or get out. The ones that refused were then arrested and beaten, and then sentenced to 4 years of hard labor. In 1838, General Winfield Scott informed the tribe that, quote, "The President of the United States has sent me with a powerful army to enforce the treaty." With rifles and bayonets, they flushed the Indians out of house and cabin and locked them in stockades specially erected for the purpose. This is when they were marched out of Georgia and to the west of the Mississippi on what was then named the Trail of Tears. The soldiers separated individual Cherokees from family, possessions, and then forced them into guarded stockades. The Cherokee prisoners were forced to make the 850-mile journey to present-day Oklahoma on foot. During the journey on the Trail of Tears, many lost their lives. Many cases of whooping cough, typhus, cholera, and starvation came about due to the lack of resources these humans were given. The Choctaw Nation began the journey on the Trail of Tears. Some were chained together, given no food or any other supplies. This to me shows the violence and dehumanization once again through the process of this removal. The Trail of Tears was known for the fatigue it set in and the diseases that were running rampant. The number of deaths that took place speak for themselves and for the conditions these Indians were put in. Throughout researching the events that took place, I discovered a recollection writing from an Army private who accompanied the Cherokees on the Trail of Tears. The writing recollects the things he witnessed on this journey. He refers to the Trail of Tears as the most brutal order in the history of American warfare. He described the sadness and devastating sights of seeing the natives drugged from their homes and out towards the west. Later, he continues by saying, the Trail of the Exiles was a trail of death. The described events from a first person was a picture of literal devastation and death. The Native Americans slowly lost more and more land, although promised that they would have their new land completely untouched. The process of white settlement eventually pushed towards the west in the later months of 1840, this causing the Indian Territory to continue to shrink. By the year of 1907, white settlement had reached the west, and the state of Oklahoma was born, meaning Indian Territory was officially gone for good. Ancestors to this day gather to speak as one voice about the tragedies that took place. Although faced with challenges, Cherokee people continue adapting and continue their customs and language. Although the Cherokees belong to multiple nations, they are still the largest Native American group in the U.S.